A new world record of a video game speedrun is one of those things where an entire community comes together in celebration of the power of endeavor, commitment, and ingenuity. Inconceivable amounts of hours of practice, meticulous route planning and optimization, lots of manual dexterity, and maybe even a hint of math. It may be hard for those outside of the gaming community to appreciate it, but I've been fascinated by video game speedrunning for almost as long as I've played games. But unfortunately, I am not very good at games. I have spent what I believe is a statistically significant portion of my life riding public transportation all around the world. So as I often like to do with my varied interests, I sometimes wonder what would happen if I tried to combine them. And this has culminated in me performing a speedrun of a transit system for the first time ever. I'm not 100% sure if it's a world record, but I still had lots of fun planning it and of course actually doing it in real life. Just ride to every station, it can't be that hard, I hear you cry. That is certainly what I thought at first, but there's a lot more than you might think. It just happens that my local transit system had lots of unique quirks to it that made optimizing this run a very interesting challenge. So come join me in my quest for a sub 6 hour BART speedrun. You don't really need to know anything about how BART works to understand this video, but if you'd like, I have made quite a few videos about it on my other channel, where I talk about public transit at length to a degree that I won't on this channel. You can also watch the run in full on that channel, and a link should be popping up right about now. BART is not really a traditional metro, it's more like a suburban train across many parts of the Bay Area. The network doesn't look a lot like other metro systems. Instead of all the lines going in different directions on both ends, we see 4 of them converge into San Francisco itself. Each of the 5 lines has a train arriving every 20 minutes in each direction. It's important to note that despite many sections of the network appearing to contain multiple lines, they're all on the same tracks. The task seems very simple. Just draw the shortest possible line around the system that passes through every station. So you'd have to start and end your run at 2 of the 5 terminal stations, and turn around at the other 3. The question is, which 2 do you choose as your endpoints? You would want the 2 to take the longest to get to, but it's not as simple as travel time. Frequency also matters. You can see that Richmond and Berryessa have 2 lines running into them, so you have twice as many trains to take you there. However, Berryessa is really far away from everything else, so it makes more sense as an endpoint than Richmond. Here's how these factors combine for all 5 of the terminals. So with this information, which terminals do you choose to be your 2 endpoints? It's not particularly obvious. I think Richmond is clearly the worst choice since you can get there really easily. I would say that Antioch is the best choice for one endpoint due to it having the longest travel time. Then for the other one, it's a toss-up between Berryessa and Millbrae. The record I was aiming to break was 6 hours and 4 minutes by HaydenM16 on Twitter. This was performed when each of the lines had trains arriving every 15 minutes on weekdays, which is slightly better than the 20 minutes that we have now. So I knew I'd have to be a little bit creative to beat his record. Hayden himself acknowledged that his run was not optimal, but even still, he had an ace up his sleeve. And you might be wondering, isn't going back and forth at some of the branches a waste of time? What if you could ride to a terminal, leave the system, and then ride some other mode of transportation to get to another branch? Would that save you time? As it turns out, in some cases, it might. BART only has 5 terminals, but a more traditional metro system might have lots more. Singapore's MRT has 9 distinct terminals, the metro in Washington DC has 10, and the London Underground has over 20. Riding back and forth to all those branches feels like a waste, and it sometimes is. Especially in the case of London, you have many other types of trains that might help you get around faster. At this point, I want to distinguish 2 different categories of how you can speedrun a transit system. In the speedrun world, you'll often hear the term any %, which basically means that the game is completed, but not necessarily the whole way through. The best illustration of this is in the most legendary game of speedrun, Super Mario Bros. In the any % category, which is much more popular than the full completion category, you use 2 warp zones to skip ahead some worlds. You still get to the final castle and beat the final Bowser, but you only play 8 of 32 levels. Meanwhile, there are runs that play through all 32 levels and hence don't use the warp zones, and indeed those runs are called warpless, and they are full completion. So how do we translate that into speedrunning a transit system? The objective is to ride to every station, so in a so-called any % run you might use other modes of transportation to get around faster, but you still have to enter or exit every station on a vehicle that belongs to the system you're actually speedrunning. Also, the vehicles you use as shortcuts should still be public transportation of some kind. I think a car would just pick the spirit of the challenge. In a full run, however, once you start, you're not allowed to leave the system until you get every single station. You must be able to trace a line across the network that passes through every station and never leaves the lines. But anyway, back to BART. As you may have gathered by now, Hayden in his run used the bus as a shortcut. Specifically, he used the 70X Wheels bus between Pleasant Hill and Dublin stations. If you wanted to get between those two stations in isolation, the 70X will indeed be much faster than doing it on BART. You will still have to get the stations that you skipped along the way, of course, but some of them would have been hit on other parts of the run. Even still, there are a couple of big problems with this bus. First of all, the 70X bus is designed for commuters, so it has a very limited schedule. It only runs on weekdays and only 4 times a day, twice in the morning and twice in the evening. That means fitting it into your schedule isn't particularly easy. The morning buses are almost off the table because BART only opens at around 5 AM. The evening buses are much more realistic, but if you time them poorly, then you run the risk of still being on a system at 9 PM, which is around when the red and green lines stop operating for the night. Suddenly, trips that use those lines require transfers and there are just fewer trains in service. Perhaps the bigger issue, however, is that this bus travels too much of a distance for its own good. Buses are just slower than trains, and the difference in speed is exacerbated over a longer distance. Also, going back to get all the stations that you missed is a lot more trouble than it's worth. Using this bus requires you to sacrifice the Antioch branch as one of your endpoints, which, as we established earlier, is the best terminal to use as an endpoint. The endpoints in Hayden's run were Millbrae and Berryessa, which are both good choices, but they work best when one is paired with Antioch. I came up with many different options that involve a 70X in some way, but none of them are quite good enough to crack Hayden's record. So it was back to the drawing board. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that there is one part of the BART system that I haven't talked about yet. And it turns out that what looks like a minor inconvenience is actually the single most difficult part to optimize in the entire run. Until now, I've only talked about the 5 main BART lines, but there is still one other piece of the puzzle. Spurring off from Coliseum is the Oakland Airport Connector, an automated people mover that runs on its own schedule, completely independent from the rest of BART. The people movers arrive on average every 6 to 7 minutes, and it takes 17 minutes for them to go from Coliseum to Oakland Airport and back. To clear the Oakland Airport Connector, you'd have to arrive at Coliseum, spend 17 minutes completing the ride cycle, plus a couple minutes on each end to actually walk from the mainline platform to the connector platform and back. You might notice an immediate problem. All of the main BART lines have 20-minute frequencies. If you arrive at Coliseum on some line and want to get back on the same line heading in the same direction, you could narrowly miss it, since the window is so tight. First of all, you'd have to find a time of day where a connector cycle fits perfectly between 2 trains, then you'd only have just over a minute to transfer between the platforms on each end, which is way too risky. Of course, if you watch video game speedrunners, you'll know they do often have to take risks to improve their times, but at least in a video game speedrun, if it fails, they can restart. In real life, though, you cannot restart. In the run that I eventually found, I arrived at Coliseum on a Green Line train heading south on the 54th minute of the hour. If I wanted to get the next Green Line train, I would be super tight on time. But of course the Green Line southbound goes to Berryessa, but it's not a load. The Orange Line southbound also goes to Berryessa. So instead of having 20 minutes to clear the connector, you now have a much more comfortable 26. But obviously you don't have to go in the same direction that you were originally heading. What I ended up doing in my run was coming in on the Green Line, but my train out of Coliseum was the Blue Line bound for Dublin. I decided to go to Dublin first because I wanted to use Berryessa as an endpoint, following what we saw earlier that it was a good endpoint. Also, the window I had to clear the connector was now looking at a much more comfortable 32 minutes. Mainline BART tends to have some minor hiccups here and there, so a bit of leeway to account for those delays doesn't hurt, not least since the connector runs freely on its own. And just like that, I was set for my run. I considered some other factors that I didn't talk about here, including the waiting time at various transfer points, and everything was looking promising. But was it enough to break the record and the 6-hour milestone? Well, I think you know the answer. At last, after trying over 20 different options, I had found a sub 6-hour route. Everything seemed to fall into place perfectly, and the fact that it had no shortcuts made it feel even better. Now all that was left to do was to get off my computer, go into the real world, and actually perform the run. If you want to see it, it's on my other channel.